If I could just start off by welcoming everybody to the very first Reform podcast. Now, of course, there's only one person really that we could invite for this inaugural podcast, and that's Nigel Farage. Unfortunately, Nigel's had to go to America to get the Donald inaugurated. So for that reason, I have got the second best, and that is Mr. David Burgess Joyce. David, welcome.
Thank you, Ken. Nice to see you again.
So, do you want to start off perhaps by telling people a little bit about your background, who you were educated, what you worked at, and a bit about your political background as well?
Yeah, sure. I've always been conservative-minded. Emphasis on the word conservative-minded as necessarily conservative. But in fairness, I became more interested in politics during the Thatcher years because I saw someone there who was a conviction politician, someone who believed in what she spoke and wasn't just giving political answers. And that resonated with me. And as a result, I was always interested in those political views. The problem I had was that I've spent pretty much all my career in law enforcement, and it would be wrong to have had a political leaning or a visible.
Is it allowed, or is it?
It is, but the police forces are very, very uncomfortable about you actually being an active participant of a party, which is quite right. That's how it should be. And I took that very seriously. And so when I effectively retired in 2014, I met up with my current partner, God bless her, and she had neighbours who were conservative activists, and to shorten the argument, got involved with them. And then they asked me if I'd like to be a counsellor. So I did a counselling job for 8 years, up until 2023. And to say that I was disillusioned with the Conservative Party was probably an understatement, Ken. They were no longer conservative. They certainly weren't the party that I was inspired by in the 80s. And I found a new home in Reform. And many people have said to me, you're a conservative-minded person through and through. Are you ever going to go back? I can tell you now, I can tell the audience now, not in a million years will I return to the Conservative Party, because quite frankly, it's broken.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people feel like that. After the betrayal in 2019, when we stood down our candidates to allow them an 80-seat majority, so effectively an 80-seat majority gave them absolute power to do anything they wanted, and then they threw it in our faces and didn't actually get Brexit done properly. So you're not alone in feeling like that. I'm interested, you were saying about that you a law enforcement background. I'm interested in what has happened to our police. Because I'm aware of generally what's happened in terms of the cultural Marxism, the long march through the institutions and so on. But the police seem to have been particularly badly affected by it. Now, is this, my impression is that this is coming from the Royal College of Policing, is that?
Well, interestingly enough, it goes back even further than that, Ken. In the mid-90s, they started to change the police initial recruitment test, and they targeted various demographics because they were not getting into the police. So they reduced the requirements, and that was back in 96. So throughout that time, it's slowly been chipped away as to the value of being a police officer. So things like, even things like employing officers who are 5'2". Clearly,
Yeah.
God bless them, they may well have the acumen to be a police officer, but they don't have the physical presence to be a police officer, and that's half the battle of being a police officer. If you can see a large 6-foot ex-army bobby coming towards you, you're going to think twice about what you do. So it goes back even further, I think, than we probably think. I definitely put it down to the mid-90s. Of course, Blair coming along in 97, he reduced the requirements even more. And so what's happened over the years is the College of Policing, which was a fairly newish organisation, decided that it would get involved with what's called common purpose, common purposes. And it basically encouraged people to be chief constables. The old days of you staying as a bobby on the beat, where many bobbies were quite happy to stay through their entire career, you were discouraged from doing that. So effectively, you joined the police with a degree in something useless, and as a result, within 2 years, you'd be a sergeant. And then in another 2 years, you'd be an inspector. And you literally spent your career, once you got to chief constable, having been on the streets for about 2 years. And as we now know, particularly in the Metropolitan Police, no one arrests anybody. No one actually fights crime. And if you look at the College of Policing website at the moment, they have a plan of action, a 5-point plan of action for 2022 to 2026. Not once in that does it mention about fighting crime. That's the College of Policing, which is supposed to set the precedent. And that's the organisation that brought in non-crime hate incidents, which is one of the most appalling travesties of any... If that happened in Russia, we'd go, oh, well, it's Russia. But it's happening in Britain. And that is how appalling we have become as a society, because we've allowed liberals to run the roost and effectively destroy this country.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in contact a little bit with Alison Pearson of the Telegraph, and you know what happened to her with two people coming to her home on Remembrance Sunday and effectively threatening to lock her up. It's dreadful.
Well, what's happening clearly is there's an attempt to silence people. So if you can see big hitters like Alison Pearson getting a knock at the door on Remembrance Sunday, you as Mr. and Mrs. Average, you're not going to raise your head above the parapet anymore. You're not going to put anything online that you may have put online. So what they're doing effectively is almost a Kafkaesque view of the world. So you're accused of something. We can't tell you what it is. And we don't even tell you that we've recorded this in many cases. And it's only when you do a freedom of information request to the police that you actually find out that this happened 2 years ago. And of course, you then wonder, I wonder why I didn't get that job that I applied for. And of course, a DBS check will show this up. And to me, in this great country of ours, that is one of the greatest travesties that we've allowed politicians of blue and red to get away with.
Yeah, I mean, I would be terrified to do a subject access request to. I'd be terrified what I might find.
In your case, Ken, yeah, probably.
But was part of it the kind of push for diversity and inclusion and so on? Did that come partly from the wake of the Stephen Lawrence thing?
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back even further. If you go back to Scarman report in 1981, just after the riots that we had in obviously Liverpool and various other places, the Scarman report didn't bring the police out in a great light, and as a result destroyed a lot of morale. Take that forward to 1999, when we had the Macpherson report, when we started talking about things like institutional racism within the organisation. Now, you and I know that institutional racism does not mean every bobby is racist. It means the institution by its practices and procedures is racist. Now, I don't agree with that. I was there at that time, and I say this to so many people, Ken. In 32 years of supporting policing from 82 to 2014, I can honestly, with my hand on my heart, tell you, I never saw any police officer acting in a racist manner or a homophobic manner for that matter. Sexism, okay, there may have been a bit of sexism, I will accept that. But homophobia and racism, I never saw in 32 years. And yet the way that the Macpherson report wrote, it was as though all bobbies needed to check themselves. And of course, the press jumped on that as all bobbies are racist and what a terrible thing it is. And that effectively cut the police service off at the head. And as a result, we've now got police chief constables who, quite frankly, have never, ever arrested anyone, have never investigated any major crime. When I joined, you actually had chief constables who had rows of medals like a Russian admiral because they'd actually been involved in military service, whether that be Korea. I mean, my first boss in the police in 1982, he'd been at Arnhem. He was a paratrooper at Arnhem. I mean, that's the kind of weight that these people had. Unfortunately, those days are long gone, and what we need is a purge.
Yeah. I mean, I hear what you're saying there. I mean, I was very interested when we'll come on to the election that we just had back in June in a second, but I was interested in that when they started having all these things about discovering racists within Reform UK. And they had, I think Channel 4 ran a documentary whereby some actor was filmed. Now, I knew that all of that was nonsense because I had been running for about a year a branch of Reform UK, and never in that time had I heard anybody say anything that was remotely racist or even in any way. So I knew that these things just couldn't be true.
But what's clearly happening here, and I think the rape gangs, you don't mind me calling them rape gangs,
No,
because
please
they are
do.
rape gangs. What this has brought to light, and again, I do thank Elon, let's be blunt, because he's been able to sort of raise the parapet where maybe somebody in this country, given what I've just said previously, wouldn't want to do, is effectively expose the establishment. Now, we bandy the term establishment round like confetti. But in reality, Ken, what it is your chief constables, your senior politicians, your heads of government departments, your heads of quangos, your heads of councils who are paid an inordinate amount of money to serve and protect the people that they represent. These are the people who are now being exposed for what they failed to do over many, many years, decades in fact, to hundreds of thousands of white young girls. Because apparently, with certain demographics, as long as you're over 9, you're sexually active. Well, the last time I looked, they're not. And this is the problem that's now being exposed. So what we have now is a government that actually couldn't care less about the Muslim community. They couldn't care less about the Muslims. They're a voting bloc.
I was just about to say they want their votes.
The Labour Party used to look after working class because they voted for them. The sooner that the working class worked out that Labour wasn't really for them, they dropped the working class. So then they went to the middle class and the university educated. And once they started to realise that some of them probably weren't worth voting for, they dropped them. And of course, they've always dropped the elderly because, of course, they tend to vote Conservative. So my view is, Ken, that if the Martians were on their way to invade Earth, the Labour Party would be sending them out postal votes because they don't care who you are, what you do, as long as you vote for them. That's as simple as it is. This isn't about some love of Islam. This is, they are the current flavour of the month for the Labour Party. And what's happened recently has been an exposure that you didn't do anything about these poor girls for years and years and years. We had a situation, and I do know this particularly, where rape gangs would be in a house. There'd be a dozen uncles, if I can use that term, and one white girl half naked. The police would turn up, having heard a commotion, and the police would arrest the white girl. I'll just let that land. The police would arrest the white girl. And there are occasions when the police didn't even ask for the names and addresses of the uncles who'd been anally raping the girl. So I apologise for anybody who feels that that's a little fruity language, but that's what we have. We have anal rape of young white girls by Pakistani rape gangs.
Yep, and I mean this is what's come out recently. What I can't quite understand is that the notion that this had been going on has been going around now for about 15, 20 years. Now, it's been fairly common knowledge. Why is it that it's taken Elon Musk to get involved before the things being given any traction?
Community cohesion, cultural diversity. These trump the safety of our children in the eyes of some people. So social workers, I mean, there's a case of a social worker, and forgive me for giving you examples here, Ken, but a Muslim man married a 14-year-old girl, and you say to yourself, well, they can't marry a 14-year-old girl. Of course they can't. Well, they can in this country. And the social worker turned up at the wedding. So that tells you the complicit nature of the authorities.
Yeah.
So we're not just turning a blind eye, we're actually participating in the destruction of the innocence of white working class young girls. Now, if that's not a criminal offence, I don't know what is. And what I think we need going forward is not what the government has offered, which is, oh, from now on, you will be held accountable if you don't obviously announce that you know of such things. Actually, we need to go back and we need to hold account every single person who allowed that to happen, whether that be a social worker, whether that be a police officer of whatever rank. those people need to have criminal charges. Now, whether those charges are criminal in the heavyweight going to prison, or whether they're malfeasance or misfeasance in a public office, I don't care what they are, but we cannot allow those people to either lose their job and just pass on their retirement.
It's a nice thought, David, but I think we both know that in the current climate of the current parts, it's not going to happen.
No, in the current climate.
So, okay, we can keep...
But I do think that's something that Reform can have in their backpack, because in 4.5 years' time, I'm convinced that Nigel will be the Prime Minister. And I do think this is something that he should promise the electorate. Whether it's possible is irrelevant, Ken. We should at least promise to act upon it, because it cannot be allowed that these children whose lives have been destroyed, and their parents, their friends, their communities, cannot be allowed to have nothing done to the perpetrators. And cultural diversity is irrelevant when you are raping a young girl.
One thing, you stood, I think I'm right in saying, as Police and Crime Commissioner for the Tory party. And one of the things that these PCCs were supposed to do was to have somebody there in charge of the police and able to direct the way that the police were operating and what they were doing. Now, it seems to me that they've completely failed in that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the original premise of the PCC probably sounded great on paper, as many of these things do, Ken. But what really happens is you've got a PCC who theoretically cannot control the operational direction of a police force, quite rightly. However, if you're the PCC, if I'm the PCC and you're the Chief Constable, and I have the right to decide whether you become the Chief Constable in the first place, then you're going to sort of fit in with my kind of views. And also, if you want me to extend your 5-year tenure, then you're going to fit in with my views. So we have Chief Constables who may or may not have the same view of their PCC, but they fall in line with their PCC. And you can clearly see that in the Metropolitan Police, where Sadiq Khan has basically ruined our capital city with a commissioner who, quite frankly, is as weak as water and doesn't stand up to Sadiq Khan. And so you have knife crime in the Met beyond belief, and yet suddenly he's rewarded with a knighthood. And what we see time and time again is mediocrity and incompetence rewarded, and it's the establishment looking inwards to themselves. And anybody outside the M25 is basically a far-right thug, as you well know, Ken. We've been had that epithet put at us many times. But ultimately, PCCs were supposed to hold the Chief Constable to account. Behind the PCC is what's called the PCP, and that's a group of councillors who sit holding the PCC to account. Now, on Merseyside, that is a group of people who are majority Labour councillors holding a Labour PCC to account. So I think you can see where I'm going with this. If you're marking your own homework, surprise, surprise, you'll pass the exam.
Yeah, I see that. Going back to you mentioned there about what Nigel should do in terms of promising to take on these vested interests that have been responsible for the rape gangs. There's been quite a commotion in the last week or two with regard to Nigel's position on this, because, of course, at one point Elon Musk said that he wasn't fit to lead the party. And at the back of that is the fact that Nigel has got an antipathy towards Tommy Robinson. Yeah. And Tommy Robinson, of course, is in America seen as being the great freedom fighter, etc., etc. How big a problem do you think that is?
I think Elon is right to raise a number of spectres. I know there's those people who say, well, you know, he's an American and why is he sticking his nose into UK politics? But we quite happily do that the other way around. So I don't have an issue with someone like Elon having an opinion. Nigel is walking a very difficult tightrope, it's fair to say. On the one hand, having studied Tommy Robinson to some degree, there's some credit to Tommy Robinson. The problem Nigel has is he's trying to professionalise the party. We are under scrutiny like no other party in the country. And as a result, Nigel has to be seen not to be involved with people who are effectively, whatever the motivation, however he's been treated, effectively a jailbird. And I think that's the difficulty he has. And I think a lot of people, it's just black and white. Tommy Robinson has represented and tried to represent this country and many of the people, the victims that I've just alluded to. But as a political party, Nigel's got to think differently, and he's got to think why.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that Nigel's walking a tightrope, and I fully appreciate that. I just don't think sometimes he does it terribly well, because what he does is he walks along the tightrope for a while, but then he goes, actually, instead of just everything going fine, he then goes and picks a fight. And you had the same situation whereby, Robinson had national marches, 2 very good marches in London, and then next day Richard Tyson says, that lot's nothing to do with us. Yeah, and it doesn't.
No, and to be honest with you, I agree with you, Ken. I was trying to be sort of circumspect from the sort of strategic Nigel point of view. My personal view is that Tommy Robinson had a very colourful beginning, and not something that I would support. But as time's gone on and he's matured, I think there's a lot more maturity in what he has to say. I do think he's been treated quite appallingly by the state, but that's because they want to silence people, just like they want to silence people like Peter Lynch, who sadly paid the ultimate price for having held a placard up at the police. So I do agree with you. I think I would have hoped, if I was the advisor for Nigel, but if I was the advisor for Nigel, I'd say, don't have anything to do with him. Say that you don't know him. You don't want him in the party. And leave it at that. Don't go into castigation and starting to.
But it's as if he can't quite make that step. He's as if he feels he has to go the extra yard to vilify Robinson in order to, as he sees it, placate his base.
And one has to suggest that yes, okay. Some of Tommy Robinson's supporters may not be people that we would want to mix with, Ken, but there's an awful lot of people who are normal people, if I can use that term, who do actually listen to what he has to say, and I wouldn't want to alienate them.
And where we will lose out if this isn't resolved is in the working class vote. Yes. It's the working class vote. Because Tommy Robinson is working class himself, he's much more appeal to the working class reform voter than he does to the middle class reform voter. And where we need to make strides is in converting that currently Labour vote to us.
And he has a huge support, I think, from armed forces and veterans because of the work that he did trying to counter Muslim abuse of dead.
It's irritating. It's irritating that sometimes he doesn't seem to want to help himself. I mean, this latest thing that he's in prison for was for he had a video silenced, which he brought out, and he was told by the court, if you put that out, you'll go to jail for contempt. And what did he do? He went on one of these marches, and he did put it up on a big screen. It's almost that's Nigel would never have done anything like that. But it's not helpful in the end of the day.
As I say, I do try and be circumspect. It's unusual for me, Ken. I do tend to fall on one side or the other, but I do understand both sides of this one. I really do. But I would prefer if Nigel just said, I don't know him. I don't really want anything to do with him. I don't want him in the party, and leave it at that. But to vilify somebody that is supported by a lot of decent people, I don't think is helpful.
No, I agree. And that going on from that, the fact that does seem to be some disconnect there between the people at the very top of the party in terms of the leadership and the general supporters. Are there other areas that you see where that is as well?
I must confess, I don't. I think Nigel gave a really good speech in Parliament yesterday, and I'm a 100% supportive of the party. I do think some of it can be naivety. I think, they're new in post. Some of the comments have been made that maybe you would have wanted to take back. We all say things that maybe we shouldn't have said in the heat of the moment. But at the moment, I have to say I'm very happy with the 5 in Parliament. I'm also very happy with Ben Habib. I think it's just a shame that he didn't win his seat, because I think there's a very intelligent, erudite chap who I would prefer to be on side.
I don't think you would have any argument from any Reform supporter on that. No. It's just a shame that it's the way it's worked out. Yes, I sometimes get the impression there's a little bit more of a disconnect than we admit, in that a lot of the people who I meet who are Reform supporters quite a number of them came out of COVID skepticism,
Yes.
whereby we all know what happened with COVID and the lockdowns and everything, and people began to realise that the government had lied to us, and they were not generally to be trusted. Now, I think a lot of the impetus for reform came out of that, and we still have a lot of supporters who have that background. The problem is that as soon as you go down any kind of conspiracy theory route on anything, you immediately open yourself up to being castigated as nutters.
But it's not a conspiracy theory, is it?
Well, some are. The problem with conspiracy theories is it's hard to know which ones are true and which ones aren't.
Well, the basic fundamental fact is we know that this was from a lab in China.
Yeah.
It was not from a wet market,
Yeah.
which is what the original story was. I remember quite distinctly at the time seeing news items. I mean, I don't have a television license now, thank goodness. But I remember seeing images in Italy of trucks driving through the streets, ominously carrying bodies out. And that was deliberately designed to scare the bejesus out of everybody. And throughout that time, the government and its actors, should we use that term, deliberately wished to make the British public scared, because that's what governments do. Governments have a reason to exist, and one of them is to keep you distracted. So that could be IRA terrorism, it could be Muslim terrorism, it could be a pandemic. Whatever it is, if you think of every year and every decade that we've had, there will always be something that the government panders to in order to scare the British people into complicity. And that was just one of them. That was a great one, because what it allowed the government to do at the time, a conservative government, was to print money. And the moment you print money, I'm not an economist, Ken, I have no qualifications in economics, but I know that if you print money, inflation follows. It's not rocket science. And so I think the government has now gone to the point whereby it has almost told many of the big institutions, what you can do to recover the money you lost during the pandemic is to screw the British public with huge hikes in prices. So the supermarkets have hiked their prices. They go up literally while you're watching. I'll give you an example in insurance companies. My car during the pandemic must have done about 10 miles. It sat on the drive. I still paid for the insurance. I still paid for the car tax, and it sat going nowhere. So those insurance companies didn't receive many claims in those couple of years. So their profits were huge. And then when we came out of the pandemic, they were allowed to put their prices up. So you think to yourself, who's being screwed here? And it's the British public as usual. And so I think we talk about conspiracies. They're only conspiracies because we want to close down the discussion.
Well, I mean, I remember going during the election. I went up to a meeting up at Sefton, and this woman got up and said, "I want to talk about chemtrails, geoengineering and so on." And immediately she was shut down. Nobody was prepared to even allow her to speak about it. Now, I know that a lot of the people are supporters, and I'm not sure about chemtrails either, because I look at the sky and it doesn't look like the same sky that I looked at 20 years ago. But I haven't had time to investigate it enough to be sure, and I'm not sure even if you did investigate it enough whether you could ever be really sure about what's going on. But it's as I say, I'm just concerned that there's a slight disconnect between the top leadership and the issues that people have on the ground.
I can only speak from my own perspective. My worry when we got 5 MPs, obviously after the initial, wow, isn't that fantastic, is that once those 5 MPs get sucked into the Westminster bubble, it's very difficult because they are effectively 5 against 645. And that's a hard one. No matter how good those 5 MPs are, to be sucked into, that world. I mean, I spent all my working life pretty much in London. I know what it's like. The mentality in London is not remotely the same as it is outside London. And I did worry that would happen. Do I think that's happened? No, I don't. But as time goes on, we need to guard against that as a party. we are a disruptor party.
Yeah.
And what we can't be seen as establishment, because the moment we're seen as part of the establishment, people will say, well, where do I put my vote now? We now have the ability, and a great ability, that we're the only opposition to the establishment.
Yeah.
The only opposition to the establishment. And we can't afford a misstep.
Oh, I agree.
And I think we've had a misstep. We had that wonderful thing where Kemi basically gave us loads of, she must have had too much sherry, I think, that day when she wrote that tweet. But she gave us loads and loads of new members, and Nigel played on it, and God bless him, that's what he does. So we were riding high then. And now suddenly we've gone down a peg. And that's a self-inflicted wound. You can only have so many self-inflicted wounds before people start to go, maybe Elon was right. Now, I don't think Elon is right, but the fact is, you've got to be very careful.
You have to look at Nigel Farage's record and say that his political judgment is generally impeccable.
Absolutely.
And at the end of the day, you have to put your colours on one particular mast. And as long as Nigel wants to be leader of the party, I think he will be. Yeah. And I trust his instinct, and I trust him as a person to do the right thing. Yeah. As I say, I just have concerns that he sometimes lacks the confidence to perhaps take on some of these things that I've been talking about in terms of the COVID skepticism. But he should perhaps take it on, and it would make my life a lot easier when I'm speaking to people on the ground to say, but really, he's on board with that.
In his defence, you can't fight all the battles at the same time, because what happens then is you just become seen as, oh God, it's going on again. So he does pick his battles, and I accept that. But I do think what we could do as a party is Nigel could pick that subject. Rupert Lowe, who I'm very impressed with.
He's been very good.
I have to say,
very good.
That's an exceptional individual. He could pick another subject. Richard Tice could pick another. And I think that would have more resonance rather than just expecting Nigel to take the lead on everything.
Yeah, I agree.
Because then you become just a whinger in the eyes of the press. And so Nigel is an absolute star when it comes to precise, like the banking scandal is a perfect example. But I do think sometimes he takes on too much. And that's our fault as well, Ken, because we expect him to take the lead on things. But I'm perfectly happy to go to a lecture and listen to Rupert Lowe talk about farming, because that man is exceptional. He really is exceptional.
He's come through very well.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on from that, let's move on to one of our main policies, which is our opposition to net zero. And I think this is probably the most crucial area of activity over the next few years, which will make sure that in 2029 that we get elected. Because the way things are going, the economy is going to be so shot by this net zero thing. Now, I'm interested though in terms of net zero. I think you can make a case for being completely stupid. I mean, there's no logic to it. It's obviously stupid. What's your view more generally in terms of climate change and whether or not it's
there's no such thing as net zero for a start. You can't have zero of anything. It's a perfect figure. But aside from that, these things, they all start with the best of intentions. Of course they do. Recycling, trying to take lead out of the air, all very valid things. But we've got to a situation now where I always say to my partner, Sharon, whenever she asks me about these things, is follow the money. Because as with mass migration, there's plenty of people making lots of money. As with COVID, there was plenty of people making lots of money. And as with net zero, there's plenty of people making lots of money. And I do think the farm issue is also related to that. Because there's a definite attempt to drive farmers out of their land in order for it to be bought by the BlackRocks of this world. Whether they be wind farms or whatever, they won't be producing food. And one might suggest that that's slightly counterintuitive when you're talking about air miles bringing a load of Marks and Spencer's green beans from Africa when we could grow them ourselves. Those kind of things, Ken. So the problem we have is we've now got a Labour government, which is even worse than the Conservative government, where it's an ideology that brooks no criticism.
Correct.
And anyone who brooks it, you clearly don't care about your kids' future. Well, actually, it's because I do care about kids' future that I think net zero is a farce. On a wider scale, do I think the world is going to end in 10 years' time? No, it's never wanted to end in 10 years' time. It's just what nature does in a cyclical nature.
Yeah.
If you go back to the 60s, the 70s,
So,
the 80s, and the 90s.
so you agree with me then that the anthropogenic global warming is not a thing? That the climate is changing, but it's there's just no. There's no.
What they've tried to do is they've tried to get the BBC, that wonderful institution, the BBC, to basically say that the science is settled. Well, the science is settled has never been said, ever.
No.
Because that's the nature of science. It's never settled. But basically what they're saying is, we'll brook no conversation about it. And the evidence clearly from those scientists who haven't been paid to give a decision that suits the government, because of course climate change brings lots of taxes, is that actually the world isn't on the brink. And if it was on the brink, why do politicians still travel by air? Why is China building coal factories every 5 minutes? Why is India ignoring the fact 1 billion tons of coal is it this year is going to be mined, and yet we in Britain are going to be cold?
Yeah, when we've got 0.2% of the emissions.
Absolutely.
It's as I say, the logical case against it is there, and it's hard. It's almost I'm surprised that the Labour Party and so on are still pushing it, because it's so obviously a bad policy.
I mean, on that, just as a segue there, Ken, I actually think that will end the Labour Party, because what will happen is their paymasters are the unions, and the unions
are already starting to
absolutely starting to twitch, because jobs are going to be lost. Not least of all the NI contributions for employers, but we're now going to get to a situation where factories will start to close because they can't.
The whole of the North Sea's been closed down. There'll be no car manufacture in the UK.
So it won't be the Conservative Party, and with respect, it's unlikely to be Reform at the moment, but it will be the unions, because they're the only people that the Labour Party will take seriously when they criticise them.
Okay. Well, here's a harder one. So we're in favour. We're against net zero. We're in favour of developing our natural resources and so on. One of the things that we're talking about is fracking. Are you pro-fracking?
I am absolutely 100% pro-fracking, with a couple of caveats, because I think fracking is a wonderful thing, and it's allowed America to be almost self-sufficient. Now, I accept that America is not Great Britain and the landmass and all those kind of things. But here's an idea. Why don't we get the fracking companies to apply for licenses in various places and then give half of their profits to the local community? I guarantee you we would be inundated with companies, and we'd be inundated with residents who suddenly find millions and millions and millions of pounds being pumped into their area, because fracking isn't dangerous.
No.
It's made out to be dangerous.
I've studied this, and I agree with you. But I also know that, I mean, one of the areas here, for example, locally, that they've talked about fracking is in the disillusionment. And I just see no way that we'll be able to convince the majority of the citizens of the world that the fracking in the disillusionment is a good thing.
Unfortunately not. And the problem we have, of course, is we have a Labour-run council. They don't have overall majority, but they still run things. And they have consistently done the things that cause Whittle residents the most amount of money, to such an extent that we're now nearly on the bankruptcy step.
40 million they're looking for.
And ultimately, I think you and I are probably going to go to the council next month to budget meeting, where clearly there's no opposition from the Conservative Party either.
No.
I mean, I went to council a couple of weeks ago, and there was no opposition whatsoever to the Labour Party or the Greens or the Liberals.
I mean, the point is, they say we've got to get this 40 million bailout from central government to tide us over for the rest of the year. But what they don't say is that's all got to be paid back. It's not free money. It's only a loan. It's all you're doing is extending the line of credit effectively.
I mean, the cycle with the council is that eventually they sell off some of the family silver. You can only sell off so much family silver because,
of course, if it were up to me, I would sell a lot.
Well, there is that, but yes. But ultimately, there's only so much you can sell off. And every single time when they say, don't worry, we're going to save money, we have a chief executive on effectively a package of over £200,000 a year, and lots of officers who are on similar kinds of packages. We don't do anything about those people. We buy things in Birkenhead that, quite frankly, no one else would touch. The pyramids, for instance, which is half empty of shops. I'm sure the pension company that sold that must have been wringing their hands when they saw Wirral Council. All of the relationship with Peel Holdings, which possibly isn't going to happen now. These are vanity projects with a council run by people who have never run a business, Ken. Sound very familiar? Like the national government. They've never seen a balance sheet. They've never created a job. They know nothing. But what they do very well is spend your council tax and taxes on rubbish. And as a result, services then are the first to fail. Do the services that are required, particularly the social services and all of those kind of things that are statutory requirements, and everything else you cut dramatically. No pay rises for anybody, and if you get abuse from the unions, well, you'll have to explain that it's because of your profligacy in spending the money. It's not that they don't get enough money, Ken, it's the way they spend it.
Yeah.
And as a result, this will happen next year, it'll happen the year after, and they just don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, the model for this is, again, going back to Musk, isn't it? Because when he took over Twitter, he cut 80% of the staff at a stroke, and then realised that nothing changed. The business just carried on as before.
Absolutely correct.
And that is the kind of model, I think, which they're going to look at in America now with this Doge thing, which he's going to be in charge of, looking at cutting back in their civil service. But Wirral Borough Councils are perfect. You could get rid of all of the assistant directors of every department and nobody would notice. Well, they're on 100,000 plus.
Well, what makes me laugh as well is that they have so many of a churn. Various people come in on very high salaries and then within a year they're gone and moved on somewhere else. But in business, Ken, because you run businesses, that you're going to look at it from who are the customer facing, they're quite important. Who are the people who are the middle managers who, let's be blunt, are being counters in many cases, and then that strategic band of people who, as you just pointed out with Musk, we could lose some of them and nothing would happen. In fact, things sometimes improve because, as you well know, if you're given a job, you then have to have a team around you, and then you're another.
The bureaucracies tend to expand themselves.
Absolutely correct. Yeah. And that's Wirral Council. But equally so, it's the NHS. Equally so, it's the civil service. The civil service is bloated beyond belief. I mean, I used to work for the Home Office, and I can tell you now, you could cut 50% of the Home Office, and it wouldn't get worse. It wouldn't get better. It would actually stay exactly the same. But you'd have half the wage. Yeah. Because there's people there doing jobs that add no value whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, the public sector productivity is back to below COVID, before COVID levels. Yeah. It's just dreadful. You mentioned the NHS there. It's one of the policies where I think reform are a bit weak. Yeah. I think we should have a more positive policy on the NHS, because my view is that it's you can talk about reform as much as you want, but ultimately I think it's unreformable.
Yes, I tend to agree. Well, what is interesting, and I have noticed, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, Ken, but I actually think the NHS used to be a religion. You could not criticise the NHS. And when you're criticising the NHS, you're not criticising nurses. No. We've all had fantastic, doctors and nurses. That's not a criticism at all. I'm talking about the organisation itself that spends money on things it doesn't need to spend on. Now, I'm of the view that mindset is changing within the country. I think people are starting to realise that maybe it's not quite as wonderful as we thought it was. Because if it was so wonderful, why have no other countries adopted it? There's a bit of a no-brainer there, really. But I actually think the way to deal with the NHS is for it not to do anything that is elective. So if you're ill, it should treat you. But if you've been to Bulgaria for a boob job and it's gone wrong, that's your problem.
Yeah.
You see where I'm going?
I've never been to Bulgaria for a boob job.
I believe not. But in fairness, Ken, I'm sounding flippant, but you see where I'm going.
I do. But it's when I was saying about sometimes I feel the leadership are perhaps a little bit behind where people in the country are. And I absolutely agree with you that the NHS is no longer this sacred cow. And people realise that, and people are now saying, we're putting more and more billions in every year and getting worse and worse results. We can't carry on like this. And I think that's why I think, as I say, our reform policy should be more positive in saying that it's the thing is not working and we need to move on with a different model.
Now, I'm not privy to Nigel and his team's plan of action. I mean, the NHS is the second biggest employer on the planet, isn't it? After the Chinese army.
That's it.
So it gives you some sort of idea of just how bloated it is. But it could well be, and again, I'm only guessing here, Ken, it could well be fighting the battles when you've got the time to fight them. The NHS is a big battle. Now, I know Wes Streeting is coming in like the Caped Crusader to do wonderful things. He may well be well-intentioned. He will get nowhere because it's too big an organisation and there are too many vested interests. There are too many pharmaceutical companies that make an inordinate... I mean, you know the examples of people prescribing paracetamol, which you can get for 20 pence a packet from your local store, and yet the NHS is paying £5 a packet from a pharmaceutical company. That's the kind of stupidity that we have. We have more managers, and yes, it's less managed. Yeah, and that is it needs
to be much smaller. In other words, healthcare needs to be delivered at a much more local level, not with this huge monolithic organisation.
And therein lies the problem. The bigger the organisation,
the harder it is to cut down.
The more you can hide. Yeah. And that's the problem we have in the civil service and the public sector is in business, Ken, you can't hide because you're accountable. And if you don't come up to scratch, you're out of a job. That doesn't happen in the public sector. I remember, I won't mention names, but I remember the HR director of an organisation I worked for. He was beyond incompetent. So they worked him out and everyone went, oh, that's good. And he then appeared in another public sector job in exactly the same job the following week. And you think, it's like you missed the point.
I remember a director in Edinburgh District Council where I was delivering a desk into him. He came into my, ordered a big desk, and I was actually putting his desk together when he came in, and he said he was the new director of tourism. And he said, I've got a meeting in Edinburgh Castle. Can you tell me where it is? So I pointed at his window and said, it's up there. It's a real problem. Going back to what you were saying about the police and how they had been infiltrated effectively by wokeism, etc. It seems to me that the judiciary are very much in the same place. That some of the sentencing that you see these days, in terms of this doesn't make any sense at all. How do we cure that?
Well, I think the judiciary is one of those organisations that hasn't possibly had the spotlight put on it as it should have done. I've been in many courts, looked at many people sitting in stately presumption at the front of the court, and I've known some of their histories, and they're not good people. And I think we're in a situation where the idea of judges being these completely blameless, wonderful pillars of the community, I think that's gone. I actually think what happened after the riots, and let's be honest, no one's condoning riots, and those people needed to be dealt with. But there are plenty of people who just said some hurty words online, and yet they have got bigger sentences than Hugh Edwards, for example.
Well,
just give you an example.
Paedophilia is the obvious one. I mean, there was for a while there, anybody who was caught with images and so on was straight to jail. But latterly, the last few years, it's all getting off without.
Well, I'm going to say something now, Ken, which people might find staggering, but I'm afraid paedophilia is rife in this country. It's not just a Muslim issue. I know that's in the news, but we have serious, high-level people in this country, judges, chief police officers, who are all complicit in paedophilia. Now, that sounds appalling. And paedophilia has always gone on in this country. Of course it has in every country. But we now have a situation where we have people who turn a blind eye who shouldn't be turning a blind eye to it. And as a result, we've allowed, obviously, Muslim rape gangs to have sway. But it's bigger than that. And we have the likes... I mean, people talk to me about, Jimmy Savile, if he'd lived, he'd be in prison now. Well, I'm not so sure he would have been in prison because Jimmy Savile knew an awful lot of people and knew where the bodies were buried.
He knew Mrs. Thatcher very well, by the way.
He did. Enough of that, Ken. I'll have nothing said. But I don't think he would, because here is Hugh Edwards, a very high-profile BBC employee, one of the biggest, announced the Queen's death, for goodness sake. And he had images of 7-year-old children in undress, and I won't go into details, but he's walking the streets quite happily collecting his pension. Now, if that isn't a reason for somebody to go to prison, what is? And this is the problem. And it sends a message to other paedophile rings, because they do tend to be not in isolation. They do tend to be in rings. I mean, my first arrest in 1982 was a paedophile. He lived in a part of the Wirral, and he went to prison for 18 years. And I'm saying all he had. In those days, we didn't have the internet. But he had magazines which he'd bought from Holland, I believe, and he had them in his possession. He went to prison for 18 years. And yet Hugh Edwards, who was paying to see porn, he didn't. And I think it tells you all you need to know about British society, which is clearly broken by the establishment we have.
Yeah, I agree. David, one of the other areas I feel that we're perhaps not as strong as we could be is in education.
Right.
Now, I think that's what's happening in education with the Labour government at the minute is appalling. You know, the putting VAT on private school fees. It's going to bounce back to hurt the economy very badly. And I just wonder what you think the way forward is in terms of education, both in terms of funding it, but also in terms of making sure that the curriculum which is being taught is appropriate.
Well, I have to say I'd probably take a slightly more jaundiced view than you do, Ken. I actually think we have a situation where we have indoctrination centres. It was quite clear that Blair in '97 insisted that everyone went to university, and that was twofold. One, to take young people off the unemployment statistics, but also that they would be indoctrinated. And we're now seeing the benefits of all of those people in senior positions, and that's part of the problem since '97. But going back to education per se, we have fundamental problems here that we are not teaching children how to think. We're teaching them what to think. And until you start getting that right, everything else doesn't follow. And so there needs to be a fundamental root and branch removal of certain bad influences and bad actors in the educational system. I mean, the education secretary is personally, I think, is an utter disgrace. An absolute disgrace of a human being and the way she has tackled education. The VAT on private schools is purely ideological because there's an assumption that all rich people send their kids to that posh school over there and all the poor kids go over there. And of course, that's not true. We have plenty of middle-class people who scrimp and scrape, don't go on holidays year in, year out because they want to give their children the best education. They are now in a situation, I'll give you an example here, Ken, which you probably have heard of, whereby a family took their children out of a private school because they could no longer afford the increase brought on by the VAT exemption removal. They went into the state sector. The state sector couldn't accommodate them, so the state sector then paid for them to go to a private school. Yeah, I mean, you couldn't write this. I mean,
in terms of the economics of it, you know, the fact that you'll have so many people moving from private to state education, there'll be no cost saving at all. In fact, it's going to be costing money.
Well, it's a similar thing to the winter fuel allowance for the elderly. You remove it, and then
they all go into pension credit.
You can all get pension credits. Well, the pension credit, if they all did it, would actually cost more than the money, the 1.4 billion that the government's saving. And I don't know whether it's incompetence or deliberate, but here is a government that clearly has no ability to do maths and doesn't take advice from anybody who does know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's quite clear, I think, that even the Bank of England, who I have my own personal views about, particularly around the Liz Truss debacle, but the Bank of England is starting to twitch now at the sheer incompetence of Rachel Reeves.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if you saw the picture of her in the Commons yesterday, but she looks half dead.
She does, yeah. I mean, no one expects that kind of job isn't pressurised, no matter.
No, but she's made so many bad decisions already.
And this is a liar. Let's be honest. You know, this is a liar. And a person who's lied consistently since she got into office. And I think it's beyond her. But equally so, Ken, I think it's beyond any of them. I think they are people who thought it was great in opposition. because it's easy in opposition. You don't have to make a decision. You can throw sort of stones and get away with it. Now you're actually in power. You've had 14 years to get your act together. And in the space of 6 months, we're on to destroying this country, this great country. Now, the Conservatives were bad, but they weren't this bad.
No, I agree. Going back to the education thing, I think the key to it is to allow parents to have some choice in terms of the type of school that they send their kids to. Now, in my view, the way you do that is to abolish all the local education authorities. So you take schools completely out of the local authority control. They all become effectively independent academies run by a board of governors, picked from the locality, etc. And you allow each school to develop in the way it wants to. So you may have a Muslim school or a Roman Catholic school, or not even a faith-based school, but you may have any type. But what it does is it then gives the parents the opportunity to select the school that's most appropriate for their child.
The problem with that, of course, Ken, is if you're a socialist, because, and I'm paraphrasing my hero Margaret Thatcher here by saying, the problem with socialism is if you allow people choice, they may not choose socialism. And if you look at what Catherine Berbel Singh is doing with wonderful, wonderful school, you would think as a government that you would want every other school to raise their bar to that level.
Yeah.
What they actually want them to do is they want to destroy Catherine Berbel Singh because they don't want people to have choice. Because if you have choice, Ken, you won't pick the socialist incompetent school. You'll go to the good school run by the likes of Catherine Berbel Singh.
Yep.
And so that then means that your socialist utopia no longer works.
But I mean, if you're going to actually make strides in having better education, what you want is for the good schools to thrive and for the bad schools to wither and die.
Now, I've got to disagree with you there, Ken, you see. Socialists don't want you to be educated. Education in this country is about keeping people down. It is about basically like battery hens. You give them just enough education to read and write, and then you get them in the factories to do the least. So I disagree with you there.
I think you're more cynical than I am, David. But no, seriously, what you want is to, and the way you do it again is the money. And so my solution to it would be to have all these independent schools, but then not have them directly funded by anybody, either by central government or local government. But what you do is you give all the people who've got children of age to go to school a voucher, and you say, "There's your voucher," and you can even have the vouchers differentiated. So if some kids got special educational needs, they get a bigger voucher. And then they can take the voucher, go and select the school that they want, and that would solve the problem of allowing good schools to be successful.
You see, the problem, just to bring it home to the Wirral, on the Wirral there are hundreds and hundreds of children who are homeschooled. And when I sat on the Children's Committee, we asked the question, which didn't go down very well, as to why they were homeschooled. And of course the answer came back, they were homeschooled because their parents didn't trust the schools and they didn't want their children being indoctrinated in those schools. And so they actually took that decision, which is a massive decision, to homeschool your children. What? There are hundreds on the Wirral.
I have a granddaughter, and I'm seriously considering trying to push her down that route because...
Absolutely. And that's a big ask for parents to do. But they were so committed, these people on the Wirral, to actually having the best education, not having them indoctrinated, not having them taught to hate their country, which is what happens in a lot of schools, by, let's be blunt, socialist-minded tutors. I mean, what's the stats in universities these days? Is it 95% of them are socialists and 5% keep their mouth shut? I mean, that's the way it works in this country. And unfortunately, as the great George Orwell would always say, the problem with socialism is that nothing actually ever gets achieved. And we are seeing that now. We are in 6 months, and the mess this country is in 6 months. Yeah. God help us in 4 years' time.
I agree entirely. I mean, I can't see any indicator that's positive at all.
And in fairness, Ken, I sort of sit there in my quiet time and I think, there must be something they've done that's good.
No, see, I actually quite like it, because I think if we've given them all the rope that they want, and they will go and hang themselves, and in four years' time, particularly when you consider how this country is going to look by comparison with how America is going to look. Because Donald Trump will drive America forward economically. It will be a huge success story. People there will be getting richer and richer, while here we will be getting poorer and poorer.
You're talking from a political standpoint, and I do understand where you're coming from. But I fear for my country that I love, because we have the...
I was going to come on to patriotism.
We come on to if you look at Europe, they're going to the right, and their young people are going to the right. That's the interesting thing. You look to America, which is the great influencer in the world, it's going to the right. We are going to be an outlier. I mean, somebody made a joke this morning on YouTube, ironically, when I was watching, that people may put sanctions on this country because we allow the abuse of our young girls. And it was made as a flippant comment. But you can almost see, we'd be doing this, if this was happening in France, we'd be saying to Macron, hang on a second, you need to stop this in your country, otherwise we're going to do something to stop it. And America certainly would, because Trump is not afraid to upset or ruffle feathers. And here we are in this country, the cradle of the modern world. We invented the modern world, and we are allowing foreign men and their offspring to rape anally young white girls. I don't know how a prime minister of this country can ever go on the world stage again with a straight face and say Britain is a great country. And so I understand where you're coming from politically. It guarantees that Labour will not get in again. Hallelujah. But in that time of 4 years, the damage that we'll have on this country, it scares me, Ken. It really does scare me. And the only opposition is us. So if you're watching this, vote reform.
Okay. Let's bring it back. I mean, this won't be so interesting for people who are not local, but I probably will, because the councils are the same all round, and so it will apply to anywhere. But I think we're talking about trying to get 66 councillors elected in 2027, which is our next opportunity to stand. Now, I was looking at a paper that got sent the other day, which is the latest thing from Angela Rayner, to say that we're going to be obliged to have another 120,000 people in the world, build housing for them, for 120,000 additional people. Now, the population of the world since 1960 has fallen, and yet we're being told that we have to accommodate another 120. So who are these people? Where are they coming from?
Well, you're quite right, and in fact, I think the average increase in the population of the world has been about 400 in the last couple of years. The demographic is old, so it's actually dying off. Let's not mince our words there. And so masses of Greenbelt are likely to be under threat. They have been for many years, and there's been great activism by the likes of Phil Simpson and people like that to try and stop it. It is quite clear that the government intends to empty all of the hotels that are currently being used for migrants, and to dissipate those people across the country. Again, going back to my earlier point, Ken, they don't care about the Muslim community. They only care about votes, and they're terrified of losing the Muslim vote, of which apparently 70% of Muslims vote Labour. So they will push them across the country. The Wirral, which is currently, I think it's about 340,000 as a population.
Yeah, I mean, I think the migrant rate in the world is something like 7%, which is tiny.
Yeah. So ultimately, there will be people who will come onto the Wirral because it's a beautiful place. Why wouldn't you? But there are no jobs here. So you're not going to come here for jobs. You might come here and then travel across to Liverpool for a job, but you're certainly not going to come to the Wirral unless you're retired. I can't see that kind of number of retirees coming to the Wirral. Can you? And so these are going to be people who possibly are going to take from the community. We already struggle with the services that we have on the Wirral. The council is nearly bankrupt, I will reiterate. And so as a result, the Wirral over the next couple of years, unless we fight against this, is going to be not the place that we all love.
But I was thinking in terms of getting 66 councillors elected in 2027, if we are able to explain to people what is going on, what is happening, the fact that the beloved Greenbelt is going to be sacrificed for this house building, etc. It gives us a very powerful lever.
It does, and in fairness, it's an open door, open goal, whatever terminology you want to use. We don't need to get 66 councillors, obviously. We need to get the balance of power, but we do want to put 66
people forward.
And the beauty of that is that even though you may not necessarily get elected this time, you can give an awfully good message in the campaign beforehand, because people do not understand how utterly incompetent this council is. There's no point in reading the Wirral Globe or the Liverpool Echo, because you're not going to hear anything negative, because they just don't give anything negative. And unfortunately, the only opposition on the Wirral is likely to be us, Ken. As I say, I've been a Conservative councillor. I know how it's run. It's a don't rock the boat kind of mentality. Well, I like rocking the boat. That's why I fell out with the Conservative Party. I have a track record of rocking the boat. It got me into trouble a few times. And you know what? I still sleep soundly, Ken. I really do. Because whatever I've done, it's been for the good of the people of Wirral, not for the good of the Conservative Party or the Labour Party. So I think in the run-up to the next election, and there will be some by-elections, obviously, but in the run-up to the next election, we are going to be an absolute annoyance to the four main parties in Wirral Council. We are going to hold them to account at every stage, because we'll be the only people holding them to account.
Yep, I agree. The other thing I think people may not be aware of is coming down the line is the fact that the cap on council tax is being taken away. And so you guarantee that the council tax increase for next year will not be 5%, it'll be probably 10%.
Yeah.
And that again is going to be a big driver for an awful lot of people to question where their money's going.
Yeah. I mean, the government, if it does give Wirral Council the 40 million that it wants, as you say, it's got to be paid back for a start. But the problem with Wirral Council is that any money from the government, whether it be a Labour government or a Conservative government, will come with strings attached. And it will be to internally look at what you've got. Yeah. Now, the Wirral Council, it just has a mental block. It cannot bring itself to cut anything. It's beholden to the unions, so it can't.
But if we got in charge of it, David, we would cut it, wouldn't we?
Well, I have to say, you and I have talked about this, and you've come up with some really good ideas around how to change it quite dramatically and change the model, which I have to say I think is a brilliant idea personally. Maybe you want to expand on that at some point later. But ultimately, Wirral Council probably spends twice as much as it needs to spend at the moment. And the issue there is the council tax, where you have to have a referendum of the people. And we know politicians don't like referendums anymore because it doesn't give them the outcome they want. Ultimately, that cap will go and it'll be a free-for-all. And we've already got some people in parts of the Wirral who are paying nearly £4,000 a year for council tax. And the problem we've also got on the Wirral, which you may not be aware, is we don't collect it everywhere. And there are certain parts of the Wirral where we don't collect the council tax maybe as vigorously as we might. And that's another problem.
I find it's a puzzling one, because my understanding is that the bailiffs that they use to collect council tax arrears are pretty vicious. Yeah. But as you say, the figures show that there's an awful lot of tax not being collected. I know, David, that you're patriotic.
Extremely. Yeah.
I've seen you in your Union Jack underpants. and
Ken, that's a vicious
socks. Sorry, it was socks. I'm not at all patriotic. I don't. Some people seem to want to have affinity with others. So you see it in all sorts of ways, in terms of following a football team, for example, whereby you have a commonality with other people who have the same view as you do. And patriotism at its root is based on that as well. That you have you look at all the other people that are around you in the country, and you want to have a communion with them, if you like. And temperamentally, I just don't feel that, which is unusual, I know. But I mean, how does your patriotism show itself? Are you a royalist?
Yes, I am all of those things, Ken. I fly the Union flag outside my garden. I do have Union Jack underpants, but that's another story.
I think you told me about them.
I am a monarchist because I think it works extremely well in this country. I absolutely love my country to the nth degree, and it is more important than I am. And I will happily take to the barricades if that's required to protect my country. Now, some people might say, well, that's jingoistic and you hate anyone who's foreign. No, I don't. I've got friends who are Indian who are more patriotic than I am because they love this country and what it's done for the world. And this country invented the world that we know of. And it's not America, it's not Europe, it's not the EU, it's this country. We fought for decades to destroy slavery. Not destroy slavery in the British Empire, but to destroy slavery everywhere in the world. Now that is a British trait.
That's based on sort of Judeo-Christian values, though, which is and that's, to my mind, that I agree with. I want to support Judeo-Christian values and implement them and see them implemented. That doesn't necessarily mean that I have to love my country, if you know what I mean.
No, and I understand that, and it's different horses for different courses. But I have a patriotism that is possibly almost verging on religion. I don't have religion. I believe in faith and all those things, but I don't actually have a religion as such. And I'm not against people having a religion as long as they don't impose it on other people.
And is it an English nationalism or is it a UK nationalism?
No, it's very much a UK nationalism. I don't have this truck about England and Scotland and all that. Yes. I look on this country as the most successful country that has ever existed. Ever existed. America, let's be blunt, has just copied what we did. Australia has just copied what we did because that is the right thing to do. I genuinely believe that this country could be the most successful it's ever been if we had politicians in power who actually cared about the country and not their own skins, in effect. I believe Nigel is one such person. I believe he puts country first. I believe Margaret Thatcher put country first. I believe Churchill put country first against their own personal aggrandizement. And I cannot get out of my head that this country is a beacon. If you look at all the other European countries, they're great in their own way. But I know if you allowed France and Germany to fight each other again, they do it at the drop of a hat because they hate each other. And it's only the EU, I suppose, that's kept them apart. But effectively, they hate each other and they will fight again. They fought 3 wars in the space of 100 years. Britain fought a war against Napoleon that it probably didn't need to and kept the peace in Europe for 100 years. We then went to war, the First World War, which we didn't need to, but we did it because it was the right thing to do. The Second World War, we didn't need to get involved, but we did it because it was the right thing to do. And we, as a country, always err on the side of doing the right thing, even to our own destruction, which, let's be honest, the Second World War destroyed this country. The winners were Germany and America, who apparently is our friend, who screwed us into the ground after the Second World War, and we didn't end up paying off America till the 80s. So much for being a big friend of Britain. America made very well out of the Second World War at our expense, and Britain lost everything, including its empire. And I put that down to the fact that we are just too good sometimes for our own good. So that's why I'm patriotic.
Good. Well, on that note, I think we'll finish.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.